So today I'm going to be going over the notes on the last half of the year, which are going to be on the Regents exam. So this is from World War II to pretty much today. We don't have a modern issues section in Mr. Orma's class, but we do have everything up to like 1990 or something. So let's begin. List the main underlying causes of World War II. Nationalism, imperialism, results of World War I, Doitism, failure of collective security, and the power vacuum in Europe. How did nationalism and imperialism cause World War II? Italy, Germany, and Japan all wanted to expand. What did Italy want to gain? Mare Nostrum, which means our sea, so basically they wanted to take over the Mediterranean. What land did Germany want to get? Lebensraum, which means living space. What did Japan want to become? Asia for the Asiatics, so they wanted full control of Asia. What treaty was signed at the end of World War I? Treaty of Versailles. How did the Treaty of Versailles cause World War II? So the Germans and Italians resented how they were treated, and destroying the German military allowed it to retool with improved technology. Why was there a power vacuum in Europe? So Russia was in a communist civil war, the United States was isolationist, France was severely weakened, and meanwhile Germany's infrastructure was left intact. So describe Doitism. So it was founded by a British air commander and engineer, and he projected massive air warfare against civilians which would be impossible to defend. And that actually did happen, like in the Battle of Berlin. What other ideologies did Doitism lead to? So pacifism, so basically no one wanted to fight again, and appeasement, which meant that the European countries allowed Germany to do whatever they wanted to without going to war. And keep in mind that we had just been in World War I at the time, so that caused a lot of destruction, so the nation's leaders were not ready to start another war. So why were the international organizations weak? Because you can't go to war without a clear national interest. What are some fundamental problems with the League of Nations? So Russia and Germany were not allowed to join. The United States refused to join, so they were basically all bark and no bite. What was Russia's first treaty with Germany before World War II started? The Non-Aggression Pact. Why did Stalin sign the pact? Because he didn't trust the Allies. List the events that started World War II. So first, Germany moved into the Rhineland. Hitler annexed Austria. Hitler demanded and took Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Hitler took over Czechoslovakia. The Soviet Union and Germany signed the Non-Aggression Pact, and Hitler had a surprise attack on Poland. Where was the Rhineland? So that was a zone between Germany and France, and Hitler had violated the Treaty of Versailles by going into it because the Rhineland had been taken away from Germany and given to France. So Germany couldn't be going in there. How did the Allies react? So the French were unwilling to go to war, so the British urged a policy of appeasement. How did the Allies respond when Hitler annexed Austria? So they ignored their pledge to protect Austrian independence. Why did the Allies allow Hitler to annex Austria? Because it seemed justified because it was self-determination. Most people in Austria are German, so that's why it seemed to be okay. What did the Czechs do when Hitler demanded the Sudetenland? So they refused and asked France for help. How did France respond? So France held the Munich Conference between Britain, France, and Germany. And it allowed Germany to take the Sudetenland, and in return, Germany promised to respect Czechoslovakia's new borders. How did the Allies react when Germany took over Czechoslovakia? So they sent diplomats asking Stalin to join them, but Stalin said no. The Allies guaranteed Polish support and sovereignty. What happened in the Non-Aggression Pact? So Germany and the USSR pledged alliances and to divide Poland among themselves. Then the USSR could take over the Baltic countries such as Lithuania and Estonia. How did the Allies react to the Non-Aggression Pact? So they didn't know what was happening, so they didn't do anything. How did the Allies respond when Hitler invaded Poland? France and Britain declared war on Germany. When did World War II begin in China and Japan? Japan invaded Manchuria. So in the 1931 or something. When did World War II begin in Europe? When Germany invaded Poland. How did World War II begin in the United States? In 1941 when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. When did World War II end? In 1945 when the Axis powers surrendered unconditionally. Who led England during World War II? Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister and Bernard Montgomery was the Chief Military Advisor. Who led Germany during World War II? Adolf Hitler, and then Rommel, who was known as the Desert Fox, was the military leader in North Africa. Who led Italy during World War II? Mussolini. Who led Russia during World War II? Stalin and Khrushchev, who succeeded Stalin later. Who led the United States during World War II? So FDR, who was president, Truman, who was vice president at the time, Eisenhower, who was commander, and MacArthur, who was a general, and Patton, who was a commander. Where did World War II take place? It took place in most of the world, all of Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, and every continent was impacted directly or indirectly. List the campaigns in World War II Europe. So the British Royal Air Force at the Battle of France, and Dunkirk, Battle of Britain, Operation Barbarossa, Stalingrad and Leningrad, Italy campaign, Operation Overlord, and the Battle of the Bulge. List two events in North Africa. Al Alamein, which was when Italy attempted to overthrow British colonies and failed, and Operation Torch, in which Eisenhower took over Morocco from Germany. List some events of World War II in the Pacific. Bataan and Corregidor, so the Death March. Malaysia, Indonesia, Burma, and Wake Island were taken by Japan. Battle of Midway, in which the Allies won. Battle of the Coral Sea, which the Allies won. Guadalajara, Tarawa, Guam, the Philippines, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, which the U.S. took, and then the United States bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. List some results of World War II. The Holocaust, the United Nations was formed, Colonial Nationalism, shift in global power, and the atomic era. List some results of the Holocaust. Demographics of Europe were drastically changed. 6 million Jewish people were killed, and 6 million other people were killed, and huge populations were dispersed. What is the purpose of the United Nations? So it's to improve the quality of life in underdeveloped nations and to provide a forum for settling disputes. That's why they are known as an international peacekeeping organization. What countries were the Big Five members of the UN? US, Soviet Union, England, France, and China. Describe the Security Council. So it was made up of the Big Five plus 6 rotating countries. Any nation can veto the action of the Security Council, which is why the United Nations gets a bad rap for getting nothing done. Because if the Security Council wants to do anything, another country can just say no. So it takes a long time for the United Nations to do what they're supposed to do. Describe the colonial nationalism. So colonies of European nations intensified their efforts towards independence because the colonial powers were weakened. New nations will emerge throughout the world. How did the dynamics of global power shift? So European domination of the world ended and it went to the United States. The United States and the superpowers set the stage for the Cold War. Who initiated the atomic era? Sorry, what initiated the atomic era? So the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which initiated the atomic era. What happened as a result of the atomic era? So countries became more cautious not to get into war because if they did, the whole world would blow up. So it would be mutually assured destruction. What was the Cold War? An ideological war between the United States and Soviet Union from 1947 to 1991 that was manifested throughout the world. At what conference did the United States, England, and the Soviet Union meet up before the end of World War II? The Yalta Conference. What were the goals of the Yalta Conference? Promote world peace, provide emergency relief, and provide self-determination. What agreements were made at the Yalta Conference? Divide Germany into zones of occupation. Germany would pay reparations to Russia, free elections in Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union would join the war against Japan. What were the goals of the United States during the Cold War? To promote democracy, promote capitalism and free trade, and reunite Germany to stabilize the nation and the world, really. So, what were the Soviet Union's goals during the Cold War? So, to encourage communism as part of a worldwide workers' revolution, which is known as Comintern, to rebuild its industries by using Eastern Europe's industrial equipment and raw materials, and to control Eastern Europe as a buffer zone to invasion, and to keep Germany divided. So basically, keep Germany divided, control Eastern Europe, redo what they lost after the Cold War, and keep everyone communist. So what were some examples of Russia being invaded in the past? So the Poles invaded in the 1600s, the Swedes in the 1700s, the French in the 1800s, Napoleon, and the Germans in the 1900s. So describe the United States' experiences during World War II. So it became the wealthiest and most powerful country, partially as a result of World War II, and home industries were untouched, and 400,000 people died as a result. So describe the Soviet Union's experiences with the war. So 25% of the population was wounded, and 20 million were dead, and the cities were destroyed. Describe the differences in political and economic systems between the U.S. and the SU. So the United States was democratic, the Soviet Union was autocratic, the United States had a market economy, and the Soviet Union had a command economy. So state one conflict the United States had with the Soviet Union before the Cold War. So the U.S. sent troops to Russia during the revolution to defeat the Bolsheviks. How did the Soviet Union get control of Eastern Europe? So they occupied Eastern European countries as they drove the Germans out. So these territories were once controlled by the Germans. The Russians, as part of the war effort, took away those countries from the Germans, and so those countries belonged to Russia. So, at what conference did Stalin announce his refusal to hold free elections? The Potsdam Conference. What speech did Winston Churchill give in response? The Iron Curtain speech. What was the United States' policy to stop the spread of communism called? Containment. How did the United States stop the spread of communism in their policy of containment? So, through alliances and support of anti-communists, some of which were dictators. So, what are two policy examples of containment? The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Describe the Truman Doctrine. So, the United States provided economic and military support to two nations fighting communist civil wars. And that was Turkey and Greece. So, what was the result of the Truman Doctrine? Turkey and Greece both defeated communist rebel groups with the United States' support, and it worked. So describe the Marshall Plan. So the United States provided economic aid to Western European nations to rebuild their economies and to avert communist revolutions. Because they knew that if these countries became too poor, then the workers would start a revolution, aka communism. So describe the Berlin Airlift. The United States, France, England formed a unified Germany with their occupation zones. So then Russia got kind of upset at that, so Germany blockaded the West Berlin in response. The Allies sent their flights to supply humanitarian aid to the city. What group did non-communist countries form? NATO, which is a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What group did communist countries form? The Warsaw Pact. What do you call it when countries are constantly in danger of getting into war with each other? Brinkmanship. Who led communist North Korea in the 1950s? Kim Il-sung. Who led the capitalist dictatorship in the South? Syngman Rhee. Describe the events of the Korean War. So the Pusan Perimeter, which is when North Korea versus the UN, the United Nations were forced to go back to South Korea, and then they made their way upwards again to fight the North Koreans. And then there was the Incheon landing, in which the United States counterattacked at South Korea. And then at the Frozen Chosin, the UN brought border back up to the 38th parallel. And ever since then, there has been a stalemate. So technically, North and South Korea are still at war. and their boundaries are the same now as they were at the end of the Korean War. So, what forces fought in the Korean War? The U.S. and the UN supported South Korea, and China supported North Korea. What are the results of the Korean War? Asia mistrusts the United States, Japan's economy recovers from World War II, and the policy of containment was deemed effective. Who led the communists in Vietnam? Ho Chi Minh. At what battle did Vietnam gain independence from France? The Battle of Dien Bien Phu. What conference divided Vietnam into two nations? The Geneva Conference. Who led the capitalist dictatorship in South Vietnam? Ngo Dien Diem. What group did Ho Chi Minh lead in the South? The Viet Cong. What resolution gave U.S. President the right to send troops to Vietnam? The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. What is it called when the U.S. sent fewer troops but bombed more? Vietnamization. How did the Vietnam War end? So the U.S. withdrew under the Paris Peace Accords, and North Vietnam agreed not to invade South Vietnam. And then North Vietnam conquered South Vietnam, and Vietnam is united under communist government. What caused the rise of communism in Cambodia? So North Vietnam used Cambodian territory to supply the Viet Cong. In response, the United States bombed Cambodian countryside to stop supplies, and this radicalized the Cambodian peasants. Who led the communists in Cambodia? Pol Pot. What group did Pol Pot lead? The Khmer Rouge. What did Pol Pot do once he took power? So he had a genocide which killed 2 million people, mostly ethnic minorities, the educated, urban dwellers, people associated with the United States. What is one evidence that Cambodia was crazy? So even Vietnam, which was communist, invaded to topple the Rouge. What are results of the Vietnam War? So the domino theory did not occur. That didn't happen because Vietnam became communist and we weren't fighting communists on the coast of California. So Vietnam became communistic and loss of life and infrastructure, and the United States became cautious to engage in land forces overseas. Who led the communists in Cuba? Fidel Castro. What caudillo in Cuba did the U.S. support? Fulgencio Batista. What was one thing that Castro did once he won the revolution? So he nationalized he nationalized all U.S. assets. So that means that he took property that was from the people given by the U.S. and he took them for the government. So the government got control of all the assets. What happened in the Bay of Pigs? So the United States encouraged Cuban exiles to invade Cuba to topple Castro. When Cuba responded, the United States did not provide promised air support, and this was a huge international embarrassment to the United States. What happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis? So the Soviet Union built nuclear missiles in Cuba. The United States blockaded further Soviet transports to the island, which was an act of war, and the people were afraid that a whole nuclear holocaust would happen. So Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba, and he withdrew missiles from Turkey. Khrushchev withdrew missiles from Cuba in return. Who was the democratically elected Marxist president of Chile? Salvador Allende. Who overthrew Allende with the support of the United States? Augusto Pinochet. What did he do once he got power? So he instituted a repressive dictatorship to rebuild the economy, and the government stepped down in 1990 after holding elections. Describe the situation in El Salvador. So the wealth was concentrated in the hands of the hacendados. The hacendados hired death squads to eliminate all opposition. Name a group of liberal and progressive Catholic priests that the U.S. opposed for being too left-wing. Liberation theologists. Who led the liberation theologists? Monsignor Oscar Romero. What happened to Romero? He was assassinated. Who did the U.S. support as the leader of El Salvador? José Napoleon Duarte. Who was the Marxist leader of Yugoslavia? Joseph Tito. What was unique about Tito? So even though he was a Marxist, he resisted Soviet influence. What did Tito accomplish? So he unified an ethnically diverse country through nationalism, stable government, and sometimes oppression. Describe the conditions of East Germany. They were moderately successful under the communist regime. They refused, refugees to Western Europe prompted the building of the Berlin Wall in 1960. Who sought to take Hungary out of the Soviet sphere but failed to do so? Imre Nagy. Who democratized Czechoslovakia? Alexander Dubček. I'll have that in the captions. So what happened to democratic Czechoslovakia? So Soviet troops overthrew his government. What do you call the policy that Soviet troops could intervene in satellite nations? The Brezhnev Doctrine. What happened in Afghanistan during the Cold War? So the Soviet Union sent troops to prop up a communist government against revolt. So what radical Muslim group fought communists for 10 years and was supported by the United States? The Mujahideen. Because of its effect on the Soviet Union, what is Afghanistan also called? The SU's Vietnam, because it's attributed to part of being the downfall of the Soviet Union. What was the warming of relations between the U.S., SU, and China called? Détente. What caused the Cold War to begin again? Reagan was elected and he was fiercely anti-communist. What was Reagan's foreign policy? Strategic Defense Initiative. What were some results of the Strategic Defense Initiative? So it threatened the balance of power. It forced the Soviet Union to invest in anti-Star Wars weaponry. Who was the last communist leader of Russia? Mikhail Gorbachev. What Russian policy means openness? Glasnost. Describe glasnost. So it encouraged Russians to discuss reforms for Russia and it allowed for dissent, which is when the people of a country disagree with the policy of the regime. What policy means economic reforms? Perestroika. Describe perestroika. So introduction of capitalism to Russia. How did Gorbachev cause democratization? So he allowed for free elections to a legislative body. Describe Gorbachev's foreign policy. So he sought to control the arms race and reinstitute détente. Name an anti-communist union in Russia. So solidarity. Who led democracy and eventually became president of Poland? Lech Walesa. What reforms were made in East Germany? Communist leaders opened up the wall in hopes that it will save communism. 2 million fled to West Germany, and there was reunification in 1990. Who becomes the president of Czechoslovakia? Václav Havel. Who was the final dictator of Romania? Nicolae Ceausescu. List the steps towards democracy in Russia. So first, reforms like glasnost and perestroika allowed for ethnic tensions to surface. Secondly, Lithuania withdrew from the Soviet Union. Third, was the August coup, in which communist hardliners seized the government from Gorbachev to stop the decline of communism. The coup failed. Then fourth, Boris Yeltsin was elected president of Russia. Who was the Nationalist, not Communist Party of Russia? Kuomintang Party. Who founded the Kuomintang Party? Sun Yat-sen. Describe the rule of Sun Yat-sen. So he overthrew the Qing dynasty and he created a democracy. Who succeeded Sun Yat-sen? Jiang Jiechi. Describe Jiang Jiechi. So he ruled autocratically, was corrupt, but he was supported by the United States because he wasn't communist. So who led the Communist Party? Mao Zedong. At what event was Mao Zedong forced to retreat from the Nationalists? The Long March. What was the status of communists and nationalists in China during World War II? So they combined forces to fight the Japanese. Why did Zedong defeat the nationalists? Because the peasants supported Mao and his promise of land reform, women supported Mao and his promise to end inequalities, and nationalists were corrupt and wasted foreign aid money. Where did the nationalists govern? Taiwan. What is the name of the country that the nationalists established? The Republic of China. Where did the communists govern? Mainland China. So that's most of it. Name the country that the communists in China developed. People's Republic of China. Describe the role of women in communist China. They were granted equality under the Constitution. Describe the Great Leap Forward. It was Mao's plan to modernize and industrialize China. He built communes, which were large state-run farms, which failed, leading to starvation and economic ruin. Describe the Cultural Revolution. It was his plan to renew people's loyalty to communism. The Red Guards closed schools, attacked intellectuals, and opponents of Mao were exiled or executed. The result was China's economy slowed down and China became more isolated. What caused the Sino-Soviet Split? Mao and Stalin both saw themselves as the leaders of international communists. So there's competition as to who is the leader of communists. And then Russia was industrialized, whereas China was agrarian. And there were also border disputes, because as you know, Russia is really big, and some of it got into China. What happened in the U.S. detente? So Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger opened relations with China to maximize the Sino-Soviet split and to isolate Russia. Who succeeded Mao Zedong? Deng Xiaoping. What were Deng's four modernizations? Farming, industry, science, and tech, and defense. Describe Deng's policy of privatization. Ended communes and leased land to peasants. Production increased. How did Deng view investment? So he supported foreign investment. What are some results of Deng's rule? So the economy expanded, standard of living increased, foreign relations improved, and crime, corruption, and the gap between rich and poor increased. What caused the protests at Tiananmen Square? So the government was never willing to allow political reforms, even though they allowed economic reforms. Who protested at Tiananmen Square? Chinese citizens and workers. How did the government... Sorry, I should have said Chinese students and workers. Chinese students and workers. I mean, they were citizens, but to be more specific, they were students. Okay, so how did the government respond to the protesters? So they sent in troops and tanks to disperse them. Thousands were killed or imprisoned. Describe the history of Hong Kong before the Cold War. So England gained in the island after the Opium War. It was ruled democratically and capitalistically. Describe the state of Hong Kong now. So England agreed to turn over the island in 1997, and China agreed not to change the economic system for 50 years. What strategy did Gandhi use to help India gain independence from the British? Passive resistance. What are two examples of Gandhi practicing passive resistance? The Salt March and the hunger strikes. Who was first Prime Minister of India? Jawaharlal Nehru. I'll put that in the subtitles, correctly spelled. Describe some issues between India and Pakistan today. Border wars over Kashmir and Punjab Plain, and nuclear arms race. What family ruled India democratically for 40 years after India's independence? The Nehru family. Which two family members ruled? Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi. So they were both named after Gandhi. Describe the economic system of India during the Cold War. So they practiced a policy of non-alignment. They got money from the U.S. and the Soviet Union, who were trying to bribe them to become either communist or capitalistic, but they did not pick a side. They said, we'll take your money, India, we'll take your money, Soviet Union, we'll take your money, U.S., and we're just going to do our own thing and not side with either one. They also had a mixed economy. That kind of is why they had a policy of non-alignment, kind of. And the government owned large industries, and nowadays, though, it's currently becoming a more free market. Describe the government of India. So local villages are still important to governing India because 55% of people in India live in villages. And the government modernized, and it was based on England's. So describe one social change in India. So the caste system was outlawed legally, but it is still practiced in rural areas, which spreads to cities. Describe the Sikh religion. So it was a blend of Hinduism and Islam. What was one political movement by some Sikhs? Sikh separatism, which is when they sought self-rule in the Punjab Plain. Name one colonial nationalist leader in Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah. I'll put that in the captions. What methods did Kwame Nkrumah use to help Ghana gain independence? Strikes and boycotts. Who was the nationalist leader of Kenya? Jomo Kenyatta. How did Algeria gain independence from France? So he fought a revolutionary war with France from 1954 to 1962. It was a bloody civil conflict. Name two problems in Africa post-independence: neocolonialism and tribalism. Describe neocolonialism. So it's new colonialism, which means that there are pretty similar conditions now as there were back when these places were colonized. And the mother countries still used cash crops and let the former colonies borrow money at high interest rates. What is tribalism? Loyalty to one's tribe or ethnic group over one's country. What is one cause of tribalism being a problem? New national boundaries reflected colonial boundaries, not traditional ethnic boundaries. So if you think back to the Congress of Berlin, those boundaries were not based off of the traditional ethnic boundaries, and those are the same boundaries as there are now, pretty much. So describe two examples of tribalism. Civil war in Nigeria between the Hausa and Fulani, who are Muslims, and the Igbo and Yoruba, who are Christian. So Hausa versus Igbo, or Fulani versus Yoruba. So also in Rwanda, there was the Hutu versus the Tutsi in a genocide. I think it was the Hutus who killed the Tutsis, pretty sure. Describe the African National Congress. Political party was founded by the Black South Africans. Name two anti-apartheid leaders in South Africa: Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. What methods did Mandela use? Passive resistance such as strikes and boycotts. What methods did Desmond Tutu use? He gained international support to end apartheid, and other nations embargoed South Africa and implemented travel restrictions which hurt the economy. Who was the last white president of South Africa? F.W. de Klerk. What actions did de Klerk take while in power? So he released Mandela from prison, legalized African National Congress, and repealed apartheid. What event officially ended apartheid? In 1994, Mandela was elected president of South Africa. When did Myanmar gain independence? In the 1950s. Describe the government of Myanmar. So it has been a military dictatorship for decades. Technically, it's a democracy now, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, but it's still pretty much a military government. So who led a democracy movement in Myanmar? Aung San Suu Kyi. That's how you say it. I'll put it in the captions. Describe the life of Aung San Suu Kyi. So she won free elections in 1990 and was jailed shortly after. The current political leader of Myanmar, and she won a Nobel Prize for furthering democracy. Now she kind of doesn't deserve it. But the reason why she doesn't deserve it is because she has stayed silent on the genocide of the Rohingya people in Myanmar. The Rohingya people are Muslim, and Myanmar is predominantly Buddhist, I think. And so she's still kind of under the control of the military government. They could kick her out if she wanted to. So that's why she hasn't said it. But still, as someone who's supposed to be in charge of human rights and democracy, she's doing a pretty bad job at it. Anyway, that's as far as we have for now. There is probably going to be another packet by Mr. Ormond, I'm guessing, tomorrow. But this is the last video I'm going to make on it. Study the rest yourself. Anyway, I hope this helps you study. Sorry I'm a little bit sick. Good luck! Woo!